The lot has already been drawn. That is the first thing to understand. By the time the condemned man is standing in the center of the square, the decision is over. There is no appeal. There is no tribunal waiting to hear his case. There is only the circle of men around him, his century, his unit, the men he has eaten with and marched with and slept beside in the mud of a dozen campaigns, and the thing they are now required to do to him. This is decimation, and it is happening inside a Roman camp, not on a battlefield, not in a prison, in the place where these men live. To understand how Rome built the most effective army the ancient world had ever seen, you have to understand one thing first. The Roman military did not run on loyalty alone. It did not run on patriotism or pay, or even fear of the enemy. It ran on something more precise than any of those. It ran on the certainty, felt in the body, not just understood in the mind, that the punishment for failure was real. It was close, and it could come from the men standing right next to you. Decimation was the sharpest expression of that certainty. The procedure was not complicated. When a unit had broken in battle, routed, surrendered, abandoned its post, the commanding officer could order decimation. The soldiers were assembled. Lots were drawn. One man in every 10, selected by chance, regardless of what he had actually done during the engagement, was separated from the group. He might have fought with distinction. He might have been the last man standing before the line collapsed. It did not matter. The lot did not ask. And then the remaining 9, his messmates, his brothers in everything but blood, were required to beat him to death with their fists and with clubs. The survivors were made to sleep outside the camp boundary and were issued barley instead of wheat, the grain of animals, the public mark of a unit that had disgraced itself. Think about what that procedure is actually designed to do. It is not designed to punish the guilty. It cannot punish the guilty. It is random by design. It is designed to make every man in the unit feel, in the most personal terms possible, that the failure of the group is his failure, that the survival of his comrades depends on his performance, and that the most dangerous thing in his world is not the enemy beyond the camp walls. It is the lot that might carry his name. The Romans did not invent collective punishment, but they systematized it with a coldness that still commands a kind of reluctant attention. Polybius, the Greek historian who studied the Roman military in the 2nd century BC, described the procedure with the careful neutrality of a man trying to understand a machine he found both admirable and unsettling. He was not wrong to be unsettled. Decimation was not used constantly. That is an important detail. It was reserved for extreme failures, mass routs, large-scale cowardice, the kind of collapse that threatened not just a battle, but the entire structure of Roman military credibility. Most soldiers completed their service without ever witnessing it, but most soldiers also knew in precise and inherited detail exactly what it looked like. The stories moved through the legions the way cold moves through stone. You did not need to see it. You only needed to know it was possible. And Rome made very sure that you knew. There is a specific quality to the fear that decimation was designed to produce, and it is worth naming. It is not the fear of an enemy. The enemy is external, visible, something you can face and fight and perhaps survive. The fear that decimation instills is interior. It is the fear of the circle itself, of the men beside you, of the lot in the bowl, of the arithmetic that says 1 in 10 and does not negotiate. A soldier who fears the enemy can be brave. A soldier who fears the lot has nowhere to put that fear except into performance, into the line, into the formation, into the discipline that keeps the unit intact so that the lot is never drawn. That was the calculation. Rome had done it, and it worked. The centurion overseeing the lot drawing does not explain the law. He does not deliver a speech about Roman values or military honor. He watches the pieces of wood come out of the bowl, and he watches the men who draw them, and when the condemned are separated from the group, he nods once, a small administrative gesture, and the procedure begins. He is not a monster. He is a man who has learned through years inside this institution that hesitation is its own kind of failure. The machine does not reward mercy. It rewards the appearance of control. The condemned man stands, the circle closes. Around him are the men closest to him in the world. Decimation was the extreme. It was the ceiling, the point the punishment structure reached only when the failure was catastrophic enough to demand a public, collective, irreversible response. Most soldiers would never stand in that circle, but every soldier who ever served in a Roman legion carried the weight of it. In the way they marched, in the way they held the line, in the way they looked at the man beside them and understood, without needing to be told, that his survival and theirs were not separate questions. Rome did not run its army on loyalty alone. It ran it on the knowledge of what waited if loyalty wasn't enough. And decimation was only the beginning. The vine staff was not a ceremonial object. It was not carried for appearances or as a symbol of rank in the way a general might wear a decorated breastplate to signal his position from a distance. The centurion's vitis, cut from an actual vine, carried in the right hand, replaced when it broke, was a working tool. It broke often. There was a centurion in the Pannonian legions whose men had given him a name, not his family name, not a battle honorific, a nickname earned through daily repetition, specific enough that Tacitus saw fit to preserve it in the annals nearly a century after the man's death. His name was Lucilius. His nickname in Latin was Cedo Alterum. In English, give me another. As in, give me another staff because this one has broken across a soldier's back and there is more work to do. He was not a fiction. He was not a rhetorical device. He was a specific man in a specific camp, doing a specific thing repeatedly, casually, without apparent reflection, until the day his own soldiers killed him. But that comes later. To understand what Lucilius represented, you have to understand where he stood in the structure of the Roman army. The centurion was the instrument through which Roman military discipline made contact with the individual soldier. Not the general, who commanded from a distance and communicated through orders. Not the emperor, who existed as an idea as much as a person. The centurion was there, in the century, every day, close enough to smell the men he commanded, legally empowered to strike them without tribunal, without delay, without explanation beyond his own judgment. The vitis was that authority made tangible, one blow for a slow formation, another for improperly maintained equipment, another for whatever the centurion decided required correction, which, in the hands of a man like Lucilius, could mean almost anything. There was no appeal mechanism for the ordinary legionary. There was no form to file, no superior officer whose specific function was to hear complaints about a centurion's conduct. The army had created in the centurion an enforcement mechanism of extraordinary efficiency. What it had not fully accounted for was what happened when that mechanism decided to serve itself. The punishments available to a centurion and to the broader military justice system ran across a wide and carefully calibrated range, and it is worth moving through them, not as a list but as a structure, because the structure is the point. At the lower end, extra duties, reduced rations, public humiliation in front of the century. A soldier could be assigned to dig latrines while his unit rested. He could be made to stand for hours in the camp square in full armor under the afternoon sun. Small punishments, administered constantly, designed to make the cost of minor failure immediately and physically felt. One level higher, the barley ration. When a unit had disgraced itself, shown cowardice, broken formation, performed below the standard the army considered acceptable, their wheat ration could be replaced with barley. Barley was what you fed animals. Receiving it as a soldier was not simply a nutritional demotion. It was a public declaration, renewed at every meal, that your unit had failed to meet the minimum standard of Roman military conduct. Every man in the unit carried the mark, whether he had personally faltered or not. The shame was collective. That, again, was the point. Higher still, the ignominia, the dishonest discharge. A soldier expelled under ignominia left the army stripped of his military rewards, his legal privileges, his pension hopes, his land expectations, and the social standing that service was supposed to have earned him. 20 years of marching and surviving and bleeding, and the ignominia could reduce it to nothing, not a veteran's due, but a public record of failure that followed a man back to whatever town he had come from, arriving before he did. And above all of that, waiting at the upper end of the structure, like a door that no one wanted opened. Fustuarium, the collective beating. the procedure that turned the unit itself into the instrument of punishment. That one will require its own accounting. But the barley and the vine staff and the extra latrine duty, those were not the aberrations. Those were the daily texture of Roman military life, the rhythm underneath everything else. A soldier who served 20 years in a Roman legion was not serving 20 years of glory and formation marching and occasional battle. He was serving 20 years inside a system that monitored his performance constantly, punished deviation immediately, and offered him very little space in which to simply exist without consequence. This is the context in which Lucilius operated, and this is why what Lucilius did was possible. Tacitus records that soldiers under centurions like Lucilius were paying, not in blood, in coin, bribes to avoid the brutal fatigue duties that could be assigned on a whim, bribes to obtain leave that should have been granted as a matter of course, bribes, in the most direct cases, simply to not be struck. The punishment machine had generated its own shadow economy. The men responsible for enforcing Roman military order had discovered that the threat of that order was a commodity, and they were selling exemptions from it to the men they were supposed to discipline. A soldier who wanted to avoid the worst of it needed money. A soldier who had no money endured. A soldier who complained to the wrong person about the wrong centurion found that the system had a remarkably efficient way of making complainers uncomfortable. The vine staff was always there. The duty roster was always subject to revision. The army could punish a broken soldier. It was far less willing to admit when the hand holding the staff had become the problem. Consider for a moment the arithmetic facing a legionary who had been assigned barley rations, the public mark of a unit's cowardice, worn at every meal, visible to every man in the camp. He had two options, and neither was comfortable. He could endure the shame, keep his head down, and wait for the period of punishment to end. Or he could find the money to buy his way back into a centurion's good graces, a transaction that was never described as a bribe in any official record, because both parties understood that official records were not for this kind of business. There was no neutral ground. Even silence had a price in this system. Even passivity was a position that someone, somewhere, could decide to interpret as insufficient eagerness to make things right. The soldier eating barley looked at the man next to him eating barley and understood something that no drill instructor had ever formally stated. The punishments were not only about discipline, they were about leverage. And leverage, in the Roman military, moved through the centurion's hand like water through a conduit. Lucilius died in the Pannonian mutiny of 14 AD, not in battle, not from illness. His own soldiers killed him, the men he had broken staves across, the men who had paid him to leave them alone, the men who had eaten barley and dug latrines and marched in the sun while he decided what mood he was in. The mutiny offered them an opportunity, and they took it. The army investigated. The investigation found no institutional fault. The machine had registered the death of one of its components, determined that the component had been replaced by the disorder of the moment, and moved forward. The records show no centurion held accountable for the conditions that produced the killing, no review of disciplinary practices, no acknowledgement that Lucilius had been anything other than one casualty among several in a temporary breakdown of order. The vine staff passed to the next man. The century reformed. Decimation was the ceiling of Roman military punishment, the point the system reached only when a failure was catastrophic enough to demand a public, collective, irreversible response. What you have just seen is the flaw. The daily administration of a discipline so constant, so embedded in the fabric of ordinary service, that most soldiers would have experienced some version of it within their first year. The extreme and the ordinary were not separate systems. They were the same system, operating at different pressures. And underneath both of them, underneath the vine staff and the barley and the ignominia and the bribe paid in the shadow of the duty tent, there was a category of punishment that the Romans reserved for something they considered more serious than cowardice, more serious than failure, more serious than even a broken formation under enemy pressure. There were punishments for crimes against the army itself, against its ritual order, against the collective agreement that made the whole structure possible. Those punishments followed a different logic entirely, not about pain, not about shame, about erasure, and the Romans had thought them through with a precision that, even now, is difficult to look at steadily. The soldier found asleep at his post had not deserted. He had not struck an officer, or stolen from the unit's stores, or spoken treason against the emperor. He had fallen asleep. Perhaps after 2 days of continuous duty, perhaps in the deep physical exhaustion that follows a march of 20 miles in full armor through summer heat. Perhaps simply because he was a man and men sleep, and the hour was late, and the camp was quiet and nothing had moved along the perimeter for a very long time. None of that was relevant. He was brought before the full unit, not a private tribunal, not a closed proceeding, but the assembled century, standing in formation, watching. The military tribune presided. He did not deliver a long speech. He did not invite testimony or weigh circumstances or consult a legal opinion. He stepped forward and touched the condemned man with a staff. One gesture, brief, deliberate, almost administrative in its economy. That touch had a name, and everything that followed from it had a name too, Fustuarium. From the moment the tribune's staff made contact, every man in the unit was no longer a bystander. He was a participant, not permitted to strike, required to. The condemned man was expected to run. The unit was expected to ensure he did not get far. Clubs, fists, stones. Polybius, who described the procedure in the 2nd century BC with the methodical calm of a man documenting engineering specifications, does not linger on the implements. He lingers on the structure, the collective nature of it, the fact that the punishment could not be administered by one man, or by appointed executioners, or by anyone outside the unit itself. The unit was the instrument. The unit struck. The unit, in the act of striking, became the enforcement mechanism of the law it lived under. Most condemned men did not survive. Those who did, and Polybius acknowledges this possibility with the same flat neutrality he brings to everything, were expelled. They could not return to their hometown in safety. They could not seek shelter from former comrades. The man who walked out of Fustuarium alive walked out of Roman military society entirely, carrying on his body the evidence of what had happened to him, and finding no door in the Roman world that was comfortably open to him afterward. Sleeping on watch was not treated as a minor failure of alertness. Rome understood, with the institutional clarity of an organization that had fought on multiple continents simultaneously, and understood exactly what a collapsed perimeter meant, that a sleeping sentry was not one man's lapse. He was a gap through which an entire camp could be destroyed. Every man asleep in that camp, every officer, every standard, every supply chain and command structure that the legion represented, all of it rested, in part, on the assumption that the man at the post was awake. When he was not, the assumption failed, and the Roman military's response to that failure was to make the cost of it so absolute, so visible, and so collectively administered that the possibility of sleep on watch became something a soldier's body learned to refuse before his mind had finished forming the thought. The tribune who initiated Fustuarium for a man who had fallen asleep after 48 hours of continuous duty did not ask how many hours the man had been on his feet. Roman military law was not structured around the question of extenuating circumstances in cases like this. It was structured around the question of whether the post had been abandoned. The answer was yes. The staff was raised. The tribune turned away. He did not watch what followed. His role in the procedure was complete. Fustuarium was not reserved only for sleeping on watch. Polybius catalogues the offenses that could trigger it with the same exhaustive care he brings to the rest of the military system. Theft from fellow soldiers, bearing false witness in a military proceeding, self-inflicted wounds intended to simulate battlefield injury, a way of leaving the line without technically deserting it, and one that the Romans found particularly contemptible because it combined cowardice with deception directed at the unit itself. Repeated punishment for the same offense, and desertion, which occupied a category of its own. The punishment for desertion could range from disgrace and expulsion to execution in harsher periods and circumstances. In the early and Middle Republic, desertion was rare enough that the full weight of the system could be brought to bear on individual cases with something approaching consistency. As the empire expanded, as the legions stretched thinner across longer frontiers, as service conditions grew harder, and the incentives of loyalty were increasingly abstract to men recruited from the margins of the Roman world, desertion became more common. The punishments escalated in response, and the escalation, if you read it carefully, is its own kind of record. The price of a behavior rises precisely when the institution can no longer prevent it through other means. A punishment that is working does not need to become more extreme. The increasing severity of the penalties for desertion is the sound of the machine straining, but it is the ignominia, the dishonest discharge, that reveals perhaps most clearly what the Roman military considered the real stakes of service. A soldier expelled under ignominia did not simply lose his position. He lost his military rewards, his legal privileges, his pension hopes, his land expectations, and the social standing that 2 decades of service were supposed to have built for him. He lost the future the army had implicitly promised him in exchange for his years. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A Roman legionary served for a period that could stretch to 20 or 25 years. During that time, the future, the land grant, the veteran's privileges, the pension, the status of a discharged soldier in his home community, was not merely an aspiration. It was the mechanism that made the present bearable. The hardship of the march, the discipline of the camp, the vine staff, the barley, the centurion's moods, all of it was endurable because it was temporary, and because on the other side of it waited something real and tangible and earned. The ignominia removed the other side. It did not simply punish the man for what he had done, it retroactively withdrew the meaning of everything he had already endured. The years did not disappear, but their value did. He had paid the price of service and would not receive what service was supposed to purchase. He walked out of the army carrying all the cost and none of the return. What connects Fustuarium and the ignominia and the punishment for sleeping on watch is not severity. Exactly. Other systems, other armies, other institutions have produced punishments of comparable physical intensity. What connects them is specificity. Each punishment was calibrated to target a precise kind of failure. The failure of the collective body, the failure of the unit's internal trust, the failure of the individual to honor the agreement that made the army possible. Rome did not punish its soldiers most severely for being afraid. Fear was human, and the Romans were not naive about human beings. Rome punished its soldiers most severely for acts that broke the structural reliability of the unit itself. The soldier who slept endangered everyone around him. The soldier who stole from his comrades destroyed the internal economy of trust that the unit depended on in the field. The deserter broke the line. The man who bore false witness contaminated the justice system that held the hierarchy together. These were not crimes against Rome in the abstract. They were crimes against the specific, fragile, constantly renewed agreement between soldiers that allowed the legion to function as a single body, rather than a collection of frightened individuals. The machine was not protecting Rome from its enemies. It was protecting itself. And it worked. For centuries it worked. The system that Polybius documented in the 2nd century BC was still recognizable in the legions of the 1st century AD, still producing soldiers who held the line under pressures that broke other armies, still administered through the centurion staff and the drawn lot, and the tribune's single deliberate gesture. The men who built and maintained and fought inside it were, by any measurable standard, among the most effective soldiers the ancient world produced. But there is a cost that does not appear in the military records. It does not show up in the battle reports or the casualty lists or the letters of commendation carved into stone. It accumulates in a different kind of document. In the complaints Tacitus records almost as an aside, in the nicknames soldiers gave their centurions, in the bribes paid in the shadows of duty tents, in the simmering specific resentment of men who have been disciplined past the point where discipline feels like order and starts to feel like something else. Rome built an army that feared its own command more than it feared any enemy. For centuries, that arrangement held. The question the machine never asked was what would happen when it didn't. Augustus died in August of 14 AD. He had ruled for 40 years, and in those 40 years the army had been his instrument, his foundation, and the one thing he had never allowed to slip from his control. His successor, Tiberius, understood this. Everyone in Rome understood this. The question was whether the legions understood it too. And in the summer of 14 AD, 3 legions on the Danube answered that question in a way that no one in Rome found comfortable. They refused to march, not because of an enemy, not because of a supply failure or an impossible order, or a campaign they had reason to believe was suicidal. They refused because Augustus was dead, and the new arrangement had not yet been tested, and there were things, specific, accumulated personal things, that had been endured for years under the assumption that service had a fixed price and a fixed end. And that assumption had been quietly revised so many times by so many centurions and tribunes and administrative decisions that the men in the Pannonian camps had stopped believing it. The vine staff, the bribes, the barley, the terms of service that expanded without consent and contracted without warning. The Luciliuses, not one man but a type, repeated across decades, protected by the same structure they were corrupting. They presented demands, a fixed term of service, better pay, relief from the punishment regime that had become, in practice, indistinguishable from systematic extortion. They were not asking for the end of Roman military discipline. They were asking for the version of it that the institution had always officially claimed to be. Tiberius did not go himself. He sent his son, Drusus. Drusus arrived with nobles, 2 praetorian cohorts, praetorian cavalry, and German bodyguard troops. It was a significant retinue, elite soldiers, visible symbols of imperial authority, enough presence to make the point that Rome had not simply sent a messenger. But it was not enough force to crush 3 angry legions without risking a disaster that would echo across every frontier the empire maintained. The math was not in his favor, and everyone in that camp knew it. 3 legions against 2 cohorts is not a negotiation conducted from strength. It is a negotiation conducted from the carefully maintained appearance of strength, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more fragile. His real weapon was not the praetorians at his back. It was the imperial name, the presence of elite troops, and the hope, carefully tended, never quite extinguished, that the mutineers still feared what Rome could do after the camp had quieted, and the names of the ringleaders had been written down. Drusus read a letter from Tiberius before the assembled legions. He offered what could be granted immediately, and pushed the rest toward the emperor and the Senate, a delay tactic the soldiers recognized almost at once. The demands were heard, some were acknowledged. None were fully resolved on the spot. The men who had stopped marching looked at the son of the emperor and understood that they were being managed, and they were angry, and they were also, underneath the anger, still soldiers, which meant they were still inside the machine, still subject to its logic, still calculating the distance between what they could demand in this moment and what Rome would do to them once this moment had passed. Then the sky offered Tiberius what Drusus could not manufacture. A lunar eclipse moved across the Pannonian night while the legions were still in revolt. To men who lived inside a world of omens and divine signal, an eclipse was not an astronomical event. It was a message. The mood in the camp shifted. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. Loyal officers moved through the cohorts in the dark, working the fear that the eclipse had opened, isolating the voices that had driven the mutiny forward, separating the committed from the merely angry. It was precise, patient work, conducted in the hours when the darkness was thickest and the men were most uncertain. By the time the sky cleared, the mutiny was losing its shape. Some demands were delayed, some were diluted. The ringleaders were identified and isolated once discipline began to return, in the quiet, methodical way that Roman military justice preferred. Not a dramatic public reckoning, but a series of small, irreversible administrative decisions that removed the dangerous men from the group before the group had fully decided to protect them. Some were executed. The records of their names are incomplete. The records of what specific promises were kept are ambiguous. Tacitus, who documents the mutiny with the dry precision of a man who has seen institutions protect themselves before, does not suggest that the Pannonian legions received what they had asked for. What they received was the end of the mutiny, which from the machine's perspective was the same thing. The vine staff returned to the centurion's hand. The standards were raised. The legions reformed into the shapes that 20 years of drilling had made automatic, Centuries in column, equipment checked, the morning routine resuming with the impersonal momentum of a system that had briefly been interrupted and had now been corrected. The camps on the Danube looked from the outside exactly as they had looked before Augustus died. Somewhere in that reformation, a centurion was promoted to fill a vacancy left by the disorder. Perhaps one of the men killed in the mutiny's violence. Perhaps one who had been too closely associated with the old regime of extortion and had quietly disappeared in the confusion. The new man was handed a vine staff, cut from an actual vine, carried in the right hand, a working tool, not a symbol. He stood before his century for the first time in his new rank. He looked at the men in front of him. They looked back. They had just lived through a mutiny that had shaken 3 legions, produced a visit from the emperor's son, and ended with some of their comrades executed and their demands partially heard and mostly deferred. They knew what the vine staff meant. They knew what the man holding it was now entitled to do. They knew the lot was still in the bowl, the barley was still in the supply tent. The Fustuarium was still the punishment for sleeping at the wrong hour on the wrong night. The arrangement had been renewed, not renegotiated, renewed. The same terms, the same structure, the same collective understanding that the price of refusal was higher than the price of obedience. Enforced now by a new hand, holding the same instrument that Lucilius had broken across soldiers' backs until they gave it a name. No one said so. No one needed to. The machine did not change after the mutiny. It absorbed it, executed what it needed to execute, and continued. For another 4 centuries, in various forms, under various emperors, across frontiers that expanded and contracted and eventually collapsed, the vine staff passed from hand to hand. The lot remained in the bowl. The circle, when it was needed, still closed. That is perhaps the most Roman thing about it. Not the cruelty, but the patience.